welcome everybody in person and also in Zoom to this event in which we are featuring a discussion with the authors of In the Struggle, as well as a pair of distinguished respondents from the field. And we will then have an open discussion with all of you. We hope that it will be animated, that you will share your questions, your concerns, your stories, and hear more about scholar activism, which is the topic of this book. So before we get started, we all want to thank the Polson Institute of Global Development and the David Einhorn Center of Community Engagement, who are sponsoring this event. And we want to shout out a special thanks to the Polson chair, Fuad Maki. And Fuad, would you like to say a few words of welcome? I'll just pass this microphone over to you, and you can stand in front of the camera so the Zoom people can see you.
So first and foremost, congratulations goes to Scott and Dan for this incredibly important and timely book. I'm really looking forward to the discussion that we'll have today. This wider question of the relationship of the university to communities is one of the important aspects of what the Polson Institute would like to promote. That's also part of a wider conversation, which I hope we'll also touch on this afternoon. That's very much in the minds of many students about critical pedagogy, the politics of knowledge formation, and also, debates around decolonizing the curriculum. What does that mean? What kind of implications does this kind of work that you've done will have on the larger kinds of debates and thinking that are going on in the university? So thank you. And the Polson Institute has a website where we give plenty of information of the kind of work we do, events we sponsor, and so on, please. So I invite you to go and visit that site. Thank you.
Thank you, Fuad. We're going to get started with a couple with preliminary comments by the authors of this book. I also want to mention that for those of you who are really intrigued by their stories and want to learn more, there are copies of this book on sale at a special price for those of you who are here, and also for those of you on Zoom, we can get you a code. Those of you who are here for no extra cost if you have it autographed, if you should wish. So I'm not going to tell you a lot about the book, but I will say that I read it over last weekend and I was very moved by it. Of course, we all eat, and this is a book which deals very, very fundamentally with the people that help feed us. The people who are, with their hands, are picking the food that comes to our tables and that are part of what has become a very, very enormous and problematic agribusiness in California. There are stories of people who are working with the people who are laboring on our behalf in and around the agribusiness industry in California, coming from traditional academic venues, but also coming from very, very deeply grounded credentials in the field that are perhaps primary over any academic credentials that they have. So we are really dealing with a group of activists and scholars and scholar activists in this book. And we're hearing the stories and seeing the connections among 8 people who all have been passionately involved in this issue. I haven't met Dan before today. So my brief introduction to him is the blurb on his book. Dan is a multidisciplinary ethnographer and politically engaged scholar whose work is dedicated to achieving social, racial, environmental, and economic justice in California. And he is now the executive director of the Central Valley Partnership, which is a progressive network of labor unions, environmental organizations, and community groups spanning the San Joaquin Valley. He doesn't mention this here, but he's also been a longtime collaborator and former student of the second person here, who is Scott Peters. And Scott, I know much better, so I'm going to ignore the blurb because Scott and I have been working together for a number of years on issues related to publicly engaged intellectuals and publicly engaged scholars in a number of different ways. We collaborated on a project that was supported by the Mellon Foundation a few years ago called The Scholar is Human, which gave rise to a book and also inspired Scott and I and our colleague Anna Sims Bartel to propose a book series on engaged scholars to Cornell University Press. And we are actively looking for excellent projects for that series. So if any of you have one, talk to Scott and I. Scott is also, as you know, someone who has been deeply involved in the directorship of Imagining America, one of the foremost engaged civic scholarship enterprises in this country. And in his own work, he looks very closely at the institutional histories of land-grant institutions. His work is deeply involved in story, not just history, but the stories of the people that are making important changes and important and thinking about important issues in our communities. So I was also really pleased to see that the scholars and the activists, the scholar activists in this book are people who are part of a really not just engaged community, but a tightly engaged community with each other. So it's not surprising. I think many of us here in this part of campus for sure know of the connections that go between the Midwest and Cornell, between Cornell and California, especially Davis. And these kinds of connections are roads that are well traveled among the scholars in this group. And also, I was really pleased to see friends, names of people like my next door neighbor across the street, Chuck Geisler, turning up in this book, and other people from this community who appear and have a role in the thinking that's going forward, as well as people like Dan Villarejo, who is the father of one of our faculty members, and also important thinkers like the person that Dan and Scott are planning on focusing on today, which is Ernesto Galarza. So I don't want to take too much time away from them, but what we're seeing are people who at many different points of entry are allies in the struggle for workers' rights in this country. And that's pertinent in Davis and in Sacramento and in the Imperial Valley, and it's important here in upstate New York as well. So I think we pass the word first to our farthest away guest. Oh, it's to you, Scott, first. Okay, we'll pass it to you first, and then I'll let you continue.
Thank you so much, Deborah. It's a real pleasure to be here in this awkward pandemic moment where most of the people are not viewable. they're in the room, but they're not in the room. So hello to those of you who are tuning in by Zoom. Dan and I owe a lot to a lot of people, and we want to make a special acknowledgement to one of whom is in the room, Professor John Forrester, who has been a fabulous mentor and colleague of ours for a long time, and also Professor Sofia Villanes, who was on Dan's dissertation committee that produced the first draft of this book that Dan and I then worked to revise and expand into the book that is now laying on the table. There's a lot I want to say about Dan. I just have deep and immense gratitude for the chance opportunity that brought us together, and very much value our continuing work. So I'm going to say just a few words before passing this to Dan. This is a complicated book. There's something that one of the characters in the book, who happened to have done his PhD here at Cornell University, Isao Fujimoto, there's something that he says as a teaching. He says, it is said, if we're going to understand what we're doing, we need to know what story we are in. If we're going to know what it is we're doing, we need to know what story we are in. This is a book of stories. One of the stories that the book tells is a tragedy. There are three elements that are interwoven in this book. The first one is laying out a landscape, a geography of the oppressive, destructive consequences of industrial agribusiness in California, in the Central Valley of California in particular. This is a history many people may know something about. When we think about that, California and the history of agriculture, if you're a critical-minded person, what you're probably thinking about maybe first is a story of tragedy. And it's not isolated to California. This is on a global stage, as many of you know, because that's where your work is. So one of the stories we are in, that Esau was inviting us to see that we were in, that he was in and is still in his life, is that story of the unfolding of that tragedy. But there's another story, and that's really the central story of this book. And that's a story that we can use the metaphor of a river to name. One of the scholars in the book, Trudy Wischerman, gave us that metaphor when we interviewed her. This is a story of a river, of multi-generational, ongoing river of activist, politically engaged scholars who are on the front lines of change work. Only half of the 8 scholars in this book worked for colleges and universities. So when we talk about scholar, we're not thinking of just academic professionals. We're thinking of people who are building, testing, refining knowledge and theory. Activist scholarship does that on the front lines of work. So the second thing that this book does that is connected to the first is that it, in a sense, lays out a guidebook of tactics and strategies for fighting back. And these are tactics and strategies that are told in the book in firsthand stories of the people who are actually doing the work. So the centerpiece of the book is revealing those figures in this kind of virtual relay race over a century plus of time of people engaging in different ways, using different kinds of methods and different moments on a similar set of problems and strategies. The third thing that the book is, and which is also a story about, and this is also a story that we're in Esau's invitation, is that the book shows us the embodiment of an embrace of core values and commitments to core values. And we can use words like economic justice, like community. We can use words like democracy to name what those core values are. The book, all 8 of the scholars in the book embraced and embodied those values in the work. The stories show us how those values look when they are enacted. So that's the essence of this book. If we want to engage in conversation with folks today and think with you, together with you, about this idea and practice, or praxis as we like to call it, of activist scholarship. I'm a historian primarily, and Ernesto Galarza is of special interest to me. He's on the cover of the book, and Dan is going to be talking a lot about him. My favorite passage in the book is where he's talking about how history, I'll just read a brief bit of it. He says, the past can be a compost pile of recollections of the disasters of the many and the triumphs of the few. In it, anyone may dig out of curiosity to uncover some missing piece of lore, to fertilize a silty nostalgia, or to settle with faded chronicles a scholarly controversy. History practiced in this way can satisfy those who view the past as residue, as a post-mortem of successive epochs in which most men appear as subjects of history, not as agents. And he goes on to say more about that. The punchline of this quote captures, to me, the spirit of activist scholarship as we see it in the study we did that produced this book, and as we feel it in our own lives and work. Galarza says, this is such a great sentence. He says, a mind placed at the forward edge of events and guided by knowledge uses the past, affects the present, and possibly helps form the future. A mind placed at the forward edge of events and guided by knowledge uses the past, affects the present, and possibly helps form the future. As I pass this on to Dan, I think we'll gain deeper insight into how Ernesto Galarza realized that sentence and where that sentence came from for him.
It's an honor to be here. It's like a homecoming, this refuge, sanctuary. I'm often in conversation with young organizers in the Valley. I live in Fresno, live in the San Joaquin Valley. The intensity of being an organizer is something that I don't think that they can teach at an institution. It's a personality trait. Cesar Chavez and Fred Ross would wait long hours to find that kind of personality. But I also think that those young organizers could either make good politicians, and I'm always looking for that in a place where we, folks of color and their allies, are starting to witness demographic changes that are going to transform their reactionary place. But also, I have my eyes out for a few people to send your way, or to the University of California. A lot of them like Cal, but I think Cal and Cornell should deserve both. I tell them, when you get tired, burned out, you hit that ceiling, you should take a sabbatic from the work and go to graduate school. You can run circles around those middle-class kids because you've experienced it your whole life. But they're going to try to teach you in a book. And what you'll learn in these very unique spaces, you won't find anywhere else. And this is what Galarza tells them also in the 70s, to take advantage of that. And maybe some of them will choose to go on to be scholars in their own right and teach in these spaces. I encourage them, though, to finish out their master's and then come back, do a few more years of work, maybe at a different level and a different role. And if they want, then go back again to take another sabbatic, get a PhD. And at that stage, they can make another choice if they want to go back into the community. And I think it's important to think of bouncing back and forth in some ways between these spaces. I come to you today, along with my wife, Donna, feeling fierce, potentially somewhat calloused. I tell myself when I'm here not to be impolite or coarse. It's so eye-opening for us to come here and to see this protection and this wonderful dialogue across difference. We work in these wounded terrains. I always thought that this book coming out in my work in the Valley, I'd be fighting agribusiness folks. And I went out and I sued Devin Nunes just to poke the beast. And I'm naming the Westlands Water District and Fresno County Boards of Supervisors. But they're leaving me be for now. I think that means I'm not being effective at poking them hard enough. But to witness the injustices and the trauma that is generational traumas this is racialized oppression that's in this book and still active in our society, and we all know that. And how nice it is to come here. I know these issues play out here in other forms in slow motion, sometimes in funding and other support, but to be frontline, as many of you probably come from those communities, it's nice to take a break here and to bring this unique set of lessons. Scott and I often have been saying that this isn't authored by 2 people, it's authored by 10 people. Each chapter, a discrete story in its own right. Tonight, we're going to talk about Galarza. When I tell those young organizers, many of them from communities of color, immigrants, I say to them that the book does not need to be read linearly. And I say you shouldn't start with the first 2 chapters. You should start with Ernesto Galarza. And then maybe skip to Janaki Jagannath and Don Villarrejo and Isao Fujimoto. A little bit of my background. Potentially it's odd that this book comes from folks that look like Scott and I. That privilege. We are in deep solidarity with the oppressed. The book is written in the voice of a student, for students, and for activists. I think it has tremendously important repercussions for faculty and especially administration. That's all for you all to fight internally here. There's a lot of pedagogical practice to close the gap between the knowledge production that's happening in these spaces and where the traumas and oppression and injustices are occurring, both in California and New York and the world. We, at this moment of existential crisis, need to close the gap between where the knowledge is being produced and where the problems are happening. I come from an activist background. I politicized as an undergraduate at University of California, San Diego. First job was with Greenpeace. They were too moderate for me at the time. I read about Earth First. I moved to Santa Cruz. Became involved with the Resource Center for Nonviolence. US imperialism in Central America and South America absolutely politicized me. I was living with direct action advocates behind UC Santa Cruz in those years. You get older, temper yourself and try to become a little strategic. Maybe your anger slows a little. Signed up for Peace Corps. Served in Namibia after the horror of US support for South Africa and the white Afrikaners in Namibia. Felt the least I could do. I worked for the SWAPO government after they had won their independence struggle and revolution along the Angolan border on the Okavango River with people who did not commodify and privatize their land. The Hambukushu and the San. Hambukushu is pastoralist, the San hunter-gatherer. It's a good time out for me. I came back and I wanted to go back to Africa. I felt like I was being of use. It's an awkward space to be in as well. A professor, cooperative extension specialist said, "Why are you going back there? The issues that play out in Africa are here and present in the Central Valley of California. Peace Corps with resources," he said. And I wouldn't have to go into debt to get my degree. I'd put down, so I did do an ethnography in a farm worker town in the northern part of Yolo County, 20 miles north of Davis. I was trained as a critical ethnographer. I took the method of an anthropologist and I applied it to my own racist, white supremacist society. It's amazing what white people will tell another white person. Just blab it all out. How they're negotiating the inter-district transfers of their children, which should be very difficult. How institutionalized racism was functioning. I put it all down. And I did community development projects at the same time, helping the folks out. I was like, wow, this is a whole new level of how to fight. I'm a Quaker. I'm nonviolent. I learned and loved satyagraha, the method that Gandhi used in India. You translate that two ways: soul force or truth force. Truth force. That is scholarship, right? At Davis, I also met Isao Fujimoto. You'll see the dialogue and how Isao mentored me in the book, how he assisted me in the dissertation. The book has a lot of sub-narratives. One of them is the connection between Cornell University and the University of California. And also just how scholars work intergenerationally and need to if they're really going to go after systemic and structural problems that are extremely formidable. You're not going to do it maybe in your own lifetime, as humbling as that is. Paul Wallace Gates, writing here in the 1940s, critiquing land and consolidation and monopoly, was in deep dialogue with Paul Taylor early on. They collaborated. Gates was here at Cornell. Paul Taylor was an ag economist, but boy, that kind of ag economist does not exist anymore, literally. Wait until you see what cool ag economists can really be when you look at this book from Paul. More importantly, Orville Thompson, coming from the education department at the time, was brought to Davis because there was an oversight at the University of California that is also highlighted in this book. There was never a department of rural sociology at the University of California. There was never, to our knowledge, a rural sociologist that was hired. The state of California was never going to permit the questions to be asked on the structure of their own industrialized agricultural system. They just omitted it. And then you'll see, as these questions are raised, as federal money starts flowing in to build the Central Valley Project, and progressive federal laws were ready to institute land reform and to support small farmers, you'll see the discursive position of the University of California, but of the federal government itself, play out in the book. These are deep lessons, because often people that from communities that are oppressed, the poor themselves, are blamed for their own destitution or internalize and blame themselves. This book definitively says it's not your fault. You're being oppressed. And by the way, here's how they're doing it. Isao Fujimoto, coming out of Orville Thompson, was hired by the University of California to start the Applied Behavioral Sciences department. It's a mouthful, but it was basically going to integrate community development within rural sociology at the University of California, because the students in that era were demanding relevant education. Relevant, it comes up over and over in the book. They weren't going to class. They were laying down on train stations, train tracks, stopping munitions trains from flowing for Vietnam War. And they were involved in the civil rights movement at the time. The students were learning more outside of their classes than inside the classes, and causing a crisis within the institutions, and here at Cornell as well. Isao Fujimoto was the first rural sociologist that we know of that was ever hired at the University of California. He came out of your department here. He was tasked with every difficult problem the university could throw at him. And he didn't finish his own dissertation until a year before I finished mine, 50 years after. You'll see in this book, and we still, as we're talking about it, people from across the globe in the United States saying, thank you for telling the story of Isao. He's literally the seeder. He seeded movements by unleashing people like myself out into the world to do the work. The book is deeply, deeply involved with Isao. And Dean McCannell, who came out of your department, who was the first PhD rural sociologist hired and does the retest of the Goldschmidt hypothesis. And you'll see I wanted to read from Isao and from Dean, but we're going to stay with Galarza because he's more of an activist. I don't know if Isao or Galarza, who's the better activist, but there's too much in here, and I wanted to have the spirit of the book and of activist scholarship speak. So I'm going to read a portion of Galarza's chapter. But finally, I just wanted to say that collaboration, I didn't choose to go into a university. I wanted to be in one of the most endemically structured, oppressive places in our country to problem solve there. And the way there's a lot of lessons in here. One of the ways you do that is you sit down in the problem at a level very close to the folks that are getting taken advantage of, and you just are with them. That is brutal. And you problem solve with them, almost as equals, co-learning. I still have to figure out how to translate this book. When I arrived after my dissertation, a close ally, Graciela Martinez with the American Friends Service Committee, said, Dan, you don't speak English. After I finished here at Cornell, you don't speak English. Discursive. I like Foucault. Let me read Galarza and then maybe open. I just wanted to say, Scott is one of the greatest teachers. They prioritize research here, right? Not teaching. Isao is a teacher. Teachers are so important. Just want to say thank you. You, especially students of color and women, you need to pick your committees well. They umbrella you, they protect you. Now, within that process, there's a little bit of bullying because they want to critique you, and you're going to get critiqued by unfriendly people as well. And so you have to weirdly see where somebody's just being a bully and somebody's who's helping you solidify your argument. That's a fine line. I'm prickly about that, and thank God he's so nice, because I tend to not be nice. So let's just finish with Galarza, and then maybe I'll pass it back to Scott. This is a section that we've been reading a lot. Galarza. Born in 1905, Mexico. Revolution hits 1910, right? Those years. He moves to Sacramento, where he begins working at about 8 years old as a farm worker. He says that because he knew approximately a dozen words of English, he was already chosen as a leader in his community. He does every job under the sun: packing shed worker, a teacher at a bilingual school, Boys and Girls Club organizer. Some of these jobs we all actually did ourselves too. He goes to Occidental College in Los Angeles, the school that Obama went to, right? First. Stanford for a master's. How do you get from immigrant farm worker to Stanford and then to Columbia, where he gets his PhD? Just that process is like genius level, right? Like the unbelievable journey. What does he do? Now, at that stage, most of us, especially if you come from that background, would pocket that and become a professor. The Southern Tenant Farmers Union had been organizing biracially in the American South during these years. Nonviolent, biracial, black and whites working together, and all kinds of farmers: tenant farmers, sharecroppers, farm workers, small farmers. Imagine how rough and tough the Southern Tenant Farm Workers Union was in those years. They decide they're going to come west and take on California's empire of agribusiness. Galarza is the person that takes that job. First thing he does, he goes out to Giorgio Farms, a massive, massive agribusiness out in California at the time. He also was organizing the era of the braceros. So this is complex because so many braceros stayed, and he documents their heroic work as workers, but the system was undercutting the ability of labor to organize. He starts dismantling that through a series of books and research, the justifications and the legitimacy of a federal law that was being used to take advantage of imported labor from Mexico and stopping us from being able to organize here. I will say that Galarza is one of the few people who wins his fights in this book. He wins the fight after 20 years, which he writes about in Spiders in the House, Workers in the Field. The entire fight against Giorgio is there. A series of litigations over the concept of defamation. But he also, by 1963, Public Law 78 is dismantled. The braceros is finished. 2 years later, Dolores and Cesar are winning contracts in California. It took him 10 years to get rid of that law, and he was destroyed by the end of that process. He spent 3 months in the hospital unable to move after those 10 years. Sheer fatigue that he writes about in here. But he wins it, and then the movement carries on. Very little acknowledgement of Galarza's role there, but now we can vouchsafe, and I will say how happy I am that the stories in this book are now vouchsafed for the future, for those young emerging scholars and activists that are coming. Here's Galarza. This is a subsection in his chapter called Engage the Enemy. Are you allowed to call people enemies? I reacted with intense interest to a remark that was made this morning, that one of the difficulties of the Mexican American community is that it had not pinpointed the enemy. I ought to tell you that some 15 or 20 years ago, more than that perhaps, I asked myself the very same question. I had been working and living with farm laborers in this state and had been moved with them up and down the state for many years coming at last to the conclusion that one of our difficulties was that we had not defined the target. Who was the enemy? So I spent some 10 years of my life in an experiment. What happens to a Mexican American community and to those who presume to lead it when they do pinpoint the enemy? And we did. I helped to organize some 20 locals of farm workers in this state from Yuba City to the Mexican border. It was our continuous effort not only to organize the farm workers, but to try to help them to understand where the enemy was. I think we succeeded. In fact, the best evidence that we did succeed is that we were so thoroughly destroyed. In some 10 years of what I like to call dynamic research, and by this I mean in areas of social experience where information is awfully hard to get at because it's very closely guarded. The only way to get it is to go out and not ask for the information, but to challenge those who are keeping it to themselves. In California, it became obvious to me that the way to get at understanding why farm labor was so exploited and so miserably lived in 100 hamlets in this state, the way to do that was to engage the enemy. So we organized with the purpose of taking down a peg or two the power of the Associated Farmers of California, of the banks and insurance companies who have very high investments in agriculture, and of the institutions that carry a role in the background as investors and manipulators of wealth. Step by step, in a series of strikes, we challenged that power. We named institutions and we named persons. We named places. Through the years, the picture unfolded, but to the degree that we did define the opposition grew in strength, in determination to destroy the Union, and it did destroy the Union. I want to warn every Mexican American who thinks themselves as a leader before they put together any organization of any kind that is going after specific targets of power. I want to warn them, they're asking for some pretty rough treatment. One of the things we found out, for instance, was that the agencies of government, they're not Mexican American agencies. They're not inventions of the Mexican peasant to come to this country. The agencies of the state and federal power were conniving, collaborating, and conspiring with the power structure, the economic power structure, to destroy the Union, and they did. Now that story of destruction, it was how that was accomplished, is a very important story. I've written a couple of chapters of it, and I commend it to you with no sense of immodesty, because it not only describes a specific instance in the destruction of a growing community among the farm workers in this country, but it also describes how that destruction was accomplished. And I think that any challenge to power in these democratic United States is going to now run into the same kind of difficulties. So one of the things Taylor says is the past is prologue. I think that is the case here as well. And there's a fluidity across time, 4 generations of scholars working in succession in this book. It's now passed off now to the students in this room and activists in this room to pick up the mantle wherever you're going to go fight. The lessons here are applicable outside of California and in other contexts. They're there for you. We're so excited to be able to share it with you. And thank you for giving us this opportunity today. I'll pass it back to Scott for the last few words.
I think in the interest of time, we'll move to our 2 responses.
Okay, well, so maybe we'll just do a little switch. Mary Jo, I believe, is on Zoom, right? Yep. So I think it'd be great if Aisha, if you could have Scott, and you could either join us here, or if you would prefer to have Scott, and how would you prefer it? Because then they can see you, right? Yeah, because I think that's a good thing. Okay, so Mary Jo will be joining us by Skype, so she's sitting right next door. But first, we're going to hear from Aisha Umana Dajud, who's a Colombian human rights lawyer, Colombian, not from with the U, but with the O, the country, Colombia, a Colombian human rights lawyer. And when she was studying at the National University of Colombia, she was part of the student movement against privatization of public education actively engaging in organizing demonstrations, helping with legislative work, and criminal defense of arrested demonstrators. During Colombia's peace process implementation, she volunteered for the university student police peace brigade, whose aim was to offer academia's know-how to FARC EP guerrilla settlements and to peasants in the area. FARC was one of the big guerrilla movements in the country and came to a peace settlement with the government. She's worked with street vendors, peasant communities, and Afro-descendant people to empower them with human rights protection mechanisms. Most recently, she was a public officer at the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, which is Colombia's transitional tribunal. She's here in Cornell now doing her Master's of Law in Human Rights at the law school. And so we'll pass it on to you, Aisha, for your comments.
Thank you very much, Deborah. As Daniel said, I'm doing my sabbatic from work. And as Scott is saying, this is a book of stories. And I was invited here and I'm honored to tell my stories. During the last year, around May and April in Colombia, we had very strong protests that most of the world listened about us. At the beginning was people demonstrating against a tax reform. During this pandemic situation, you can imagine that the tax reform for the society, it's a big thing. During the demonstration, the government decided to implement a health reform too, which probably doesn't make sense during a pandemic situation. More people were very angry about what was happening. After some weeks of protesting during this situation, many demonstrators were killed by the police. One of them was Lucas Villa. He was a university student in a city called Pereira. His last words were, "We remember each other in our hearts." All this movement was about social activism. The society was protesting, but there wasn't political activism because there is a lack of trust to the political participation in our country. At that point, I was at one moment going from the rural part of Colombia to Bogota for a meeting. And we had to go through many roadblocks. So the demonstrators were blocking the street and we couldn't really get to the cities. When I met these people blocking there, you could see how this organization was working. The people, the peasants, the workers were blocking the streets, and the university students were organizing them. In every part of this demonstration was at least one university student trying to organize the social protests. And we began to see how is this discussion between academia and social protest. What Ernesto Galarza in some point of the book is calling it the social power. This, after a lot of denounces, we were doing a lot of legal work, trying to take the persons out of the prisons because a lot of persons were arrested. A lot of persons were murdered too by the state. And at one point, those international governments were really pushing Colombia's government to go back and to stop the situation because it was totally unlogic. The protest stopped, but it was a huge movement for health rights, for social rights, for economical rights. And at one point, we were all asking, what's next? We don't have a political movement, it's just a social movement. We need to go through this situation and to translate these problems. But to who? And one of the answers could be to the academia. That's one of the questions that the book was answering to me when I was reading it. Academia could be one of this subject that will translate the social problems to solutions and to build the future. When I was doing the volunteer work in the Peace Brigade during the implementation of the peace process in 2016, more than 300 professional students were going to the FARC settlements. So the FARC combatants were going to some places around the country to do a transition from the violent fight to the peaceful fight. And many of us, we wonder to teach, in my special case, was alternative mechanism of conflict resolution. Some others were physicians, others were teachers to build this community. At the very end of this social work, we were talking to each other and saying, you know what? We think that we learn more from them than what they learn from us. We're trying to teach them, and they taught us. But this social fight have limits, as we saw in the protest during this year, as we are seeing with our peace process, as we're seeing in all the social activism in Colombia. The current situation isn't that good. We have a feeling of frustration. In 2016, we're learning what peace means. Only 32 social activists were killed. This is a very low rate for us. In 2021, more than 300 or 400 social activists are being killed per year. We're going back to our violent situation. And what's happening? What's happening if so many people are working on this? We don't really know. We don't really know how to address the situation. I was working with some Afro-descendant community in the rainforest of Chocó in 2018, teaching them human rights protection mechanism. Because, not to be their lawyers, because I don't believe in this idea of lawyers representing person and being the stars of the situation, litigating and just having the floor for them. No. Academia and professional, we need to teach them, to empower them, to give them the tools to fight for their communities. And that's a big part of our work. To bring this, how Ernesto Galarza say, the possibility to change the history. In conclusion of the reading, that brings me many ideas, and thank you for writing it. It's going to be very important for my sabbatic year here. We can have the conclusion that usually there is a limit in academia, and it's the lack of reality. But also, there is a limit in the social movement, and it's the lack of time. People get tired. Time is going on, and things are happening. Social movement don't have time, but academia have it. The academia has it and can address these problems, or work on it, and try to change the history. It is a discussion between this reality and this academia and this capacity to translate all these social problems. So what's the main question? And it's how to build this bridge between the social activism and the academia, how to tie this relationship, how to bring trust between them so we can change the history. And this is something that this book is teaching us, how to achieve this change and apply them in our research, and how to bring this knowledge from the social movement and to the academia and in the other way. Thank
You're going to turn to Mary Jo on Zoom, right? Okay. While that's happening, there's Mary Jo. Mary Jo Dudley is the director of the Cornell Farm Worker program here, and she's been a longtime collaborator and friend of mine since before the time that she was involved in the Farm Worker program when we worked together in Latin American studies. However, right now, and for quite a few of the last years of this phase of Mary Jo's life, she has been intensely dedicated to the mission of understanding and supporting farm workers and their needs in upstate New York. The Cornell Farm Worker Program, thus, is a program that is both a community activist program and has been since its founding, but is also a program which is helping students to understand activist research as well as connecting faculty with activist research in support of the mission of responding to farm workers' needs and farm worker goals. That is the research that Mary Jo is involved in never comes from the ivory tower, the heads of people who say, wouldn't this be interesting? It comes from the people on the ground in the field who are in the fields, literally in the fields, who are saying, this is what we need. This is where you can collaborate with us. So I'll pass it over to Mary Jo.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the opportunity to reflect on this book. First of all, I'd like to say to anyone who's in the audience, it's a wonderful book, and it's a wonderful book because it's based on real people's stories. So if you don't care about agriculture, you don't care about farm workers, it's worth reading. It has so many gems, and the imagery is quite moving. I also responded to one of the excerpts that Scott read about history as a way to resuscitate the recollections from the compost pile of disasters. The framing of how each of these actors in the book frame their reality and how they have worked throughout the years to understand the structures of power and society, and to think about that from the framework of how to bring about social and political change. So from the very framework, what's interesting, if you look at the titles of the chapters, they talk about battles, preparation for battle, study your target. And it's really interesting to see the strategies, because these strategies are how they understand the structures of power, how they understand strategies to silence, to obscure, to undermine, to threaten, to marginalize. And one of the other aspects of the book, which is an underlying theme, is that of values and principles. Work driven by a moral compass. Work that tries to look at justice, equity, empowerment, all from the framework of hope and encouragement. I personally am a big fan of the ethnographic research methodologies. That's what I use in my work, because this is a way to produce knowledge systematically. It's in the book, they make reference to it as research, as everyday work, conversations that take place, listening. And that's something that's been very critical in our work with farm workers, is how to partner with people as they are developing their strategies to bring about social and political change. I also like that the book is a guidebook of sorts, and it has a whole list of guideposts in the conclusions. But all of the speakers, all of the actors in the book make some reference to how to anchor yourself as a researcher. Study something close to you. Work on something real. Answer actual lived problems. And I think these are some guidelines that are helpful for all of us. both understanding how to be part of the process and understanding that change is possible. And one part of that is by demystifying the edifice, I think Don Villarejo said, looking at institutions, understanding the power of institutions, and hopeful at the same time, because each of the chapters talk about the need to have a strategy, but also resolve and to pay close attention to the process. One of the guidelines in this book, which I found very interesting and something that has affected me in my work and in our collaboration with farm workers, is how important it is to pay close attention to the process. And I think it was Don Villarejo who said, understand the process and then a choice can be made. You can choose to take a liberal perspective and then you will use liberal methods, or you can take a radical perspective and you will have to decide what kind of radical you want to be. But all of these things really create an arena in which we can put some thought into our own scholarship, into our own work, and think about how we can structure research with a public purpose. And this comes back to other work that Scott has worked on. We are a land grant institution, all of us. You're in the law school, you're part of Cornell University, which is a land grant institution. So thinking about our research as making a contribution to the stakeholders, those who live in the state, but also looking at ways that we can bring about positive social change through our research. I've seen examples of that in my own work, and what is sometimes, it brings pause when you think how long it takes to bring about this change. I think it was about 15 years ago when we were engaged in discussions with then Governor Spitzer about reopening driver's licenses to everyone in the state, regardless of their immigration status. That had been the case for New York State before 9/11. And Governor Spitzer proposed, he said, yes, we will do that. But his opposition came from corners where perhaps he hadn't anticipated it. It came from corners of people who worked at the Department of Motor Vehicles who didn't want to be put in that position of not being able to use the documents they traditionally used. 15 years later, the state reopened driver's licenses regardless of immigration status. Why does this matter? For the farm workers, they talked about living in very geographically isolated places and not being able to drive. Story after story of parents with children who were sick in the middle of the night, and their choices were to drive without a license to get the medical care that child needed, or to call an ambulance, which was going to be super expensive. So I think part of this is understanding that the process takes time, and actually how we move forward can be very small steps. But we can move forward. Change is possible. And that's what we need to think about. One of the chapters talked about understanding structures in the community, agribusiness as an entity, as an institution, the state as an entity, but also the university as an entity. And the statement was, the university is not a democracy, and it's not a meritocracy. So you need to be doing what you're doing, not expecting that others will reward you because you're doing such a wonderful job. But it comes back to that core argument in the book. Study something close to you. Work on something real and answer actual lived problems. And I know we want to have discussion, but those are some of the things that are my reflections on what I see as a wonderful book. It should be on the Goodreads list.
Thank you so much, Mary Jo, and thank you, Aisha and Dan and Scott. I remind you once again, because a couple people arrived later, that there's piles of physical books if people want to purchase them from Scott and Dan after this event. But meanwhile, we have almost 20 minutes for conversation, for testimonies, for questions, concerns, anything you want to raise. And we also invite those of you who are joining us via Zoom to raise your questions and comments. And we have somebody monitoring the Zoom feed who can help to make sure that your voices are also heard. So does anyone want to start and with a comment or question or testimony? Otherwise, I call out Sophia. You were mentioned, Sophia, before you came in as a mentor.
I've got one of the most traditional questions. You guys have a do-over thought. It's been at the publisher for a year. You've been going around giving these talks. If there were one or two things you wish you had done differently, or if there were one or two things you wish you had done differently, or would have pulled out more from the interviews, for example, what would that have been?
I've gone over the book. I don't know how, the book took 20 years. So I'm way over the book, even though we're talking about the book a lot. I'm actually been doing 10 years of other work and thinking, wow, maybe I should start that book project. So we thoroughly went over it. One of the battles was one that the editor at the publisher, an early one, said that all the excerpts, the first person testimony in the book, we needed to rewrite those all in our own voice. And I said to the person, and Scott and John, your influence was here, but I was like, that is the power of this book, the first person voice. And I said, maybe we have to wait again. We weren't going to compromise there, but
That guy, didn't
they did fire him. And so there was no way that I was not going to have this story be told by the people who experienced it. Some of them are past now and I never met. Some of them are very, very, very close people to me. And I walk on Huntington Boulevard down Fresno with Donna almost every night. And for the last 2 months, I've reread it a few times since. I'm so deeply grateful that these stories are not going to be lost in time. So for me, I found a place there was a quote that was left out. So that level, overall, there was a few things. The dissertation has more information than the book. There's a few quotes that were super powerful that we took out, and some stories. McCannell and Villarejo told fantastic stories of being a scholar in the 1960s and 70s, and Esau too. And we did some of that we had to take out just to keep it focused on the narrative, on the target of agribusiness and democracy. They are connected, right? You have to have an equitable economy if you're going to have a democracy. That is empirically proven in the book. And the challenge now is disprove it. And if you want to start that argument, I'm here. I'm ready to start it. And nobody's argued with me yet, but I'm pretty much satisfied with the book at this point.
And he used to be a football player, so watch out. What I would say, John, and I think this is an important thing in the realm of this kind of activist scholarship that we're talking about. It is still remarkably unusual to let people tell their own stories and speak in their own voice and not try to speak on for them by summarizing what they're saying. So what Dan had mentioned that we had encountered with the first person who was working with us to edit the manuscript that we gave them just represented that continues to be a challenge. And I just want to say that I've been doing oral histories now for more than 20 years. Thank you, John Forrester, for reminding me something I knew all my life, which is that stories are powerful. So I think part of what is innovative and interesting now is how can we invite people into building and creating knowledge, but through the stories that they tell. I think we're going to need distance on this book to know whether we did it all that well in this book or not. But I think what's more interesting to us is what's next, and what are the ideas other people have for creating powerful works that can be useful on the front lines, on the leading edge of events, as Galarza says.
Oh, I have a question back here. Hi, I'm Carolina Osorio Gil. I am a grad student in DSOC, and I feel like, Dan, like we're at least 2/3 academic siblings because we have two of the same committee members, Professor Sofia Villenas and Scott Peters. So that's pretty awesome. Before I came I was already in Ithaca. I've been here forever. But I was a community organizer for many years. And my question is, like, a couple of years ago, since also Professor Castillo, who is another friend and collaborator, my third committee member, by the way, mentioned testimonios. Like for me, a couple of years ago, I had to take a health leave. And it was a mental health leave. And it was because, in part, I had a feeling of despair, having come from doing work with people and actually collaborating with Mary Jo as one of them. And just feeling like here in academia, I wasn't doing anything. Like I wasn't actually doing anything. I was writing and thinking, and like, that's not doing something to me. And I had a discussion with a professor, and he said, well, this is the work to me, like this writing and thinking, this is the work. And so I guess my question to you is a bittersweet question about, like, have you like managed this kind of despair? And if so, like, and also where do you find like the hope and the drive? And it's something, you know, I meet with Scott a lot that I would really like to know, I guess, from Scott too. I don't think I've ever actually asked him that, but I've wondered it. You know, and I think just to put it also in terms of development sociology and global development, which we study, I feel like we're just in this, like deep in all of the terrible things of the world. And, you know, I think like somehow we all keep going, but I'd like to know that from you all. Thank you.
I'm incredibly hopeful. There's been times when I've been a scholar that I was pressured to change things. Often, almost every time the pressure came to mute, obscure, cloud the intensity of what I was writing for the benefit of the powerful and against the oppressed. So you might be right now, it's good that you're not feeling that. If you keep on that critical tact, you will likely feel it. And you know, there's something I come back to, an axiom: pressure indicates relevance. And remember, I'm kind of feel an obligation to write for those students in the 60s. And I came from an activist background, and I felt like 500,000 people in the streets in 2003 in March and April, and millions across the globe couldn't stop that war, right? And the injustices that we're all seeing in our society, this rise of nationalism, racism, and fascism, just now, just coming. So we are playing a very, very important role as scholars. The other day, I presented to climate activists in Stockton, all young people of color. One young, I think she's Filipina, she's listening to the book, hearing me. You know what she says? She goes, "You're recruiting Padawans." And I just sat there for a minute. I go, yeah, I want you to fight differently. I want a few of you to learn to fight differently. And I can't teach you all of those ways of fighting. But if you come into these spaces, into all of this, into your seminars, and together with other Padawans, yes, we can start figuring it out. And finally, an incredible lesson in this is community. In community within a group of scholars, and community also not with everyone can be a scholar. So returning as Esau and Galarza invites us back to community is a refuge for yourself when you start feeling this ennui or this, the community will reconnect you to the problem and the spirit and the justification and your own role and purpose. So I learned that from Esau and Galarza.
Ernesto is saying something to this feeling, and it's, I want to warn every Mexican American who thinks of himself as leader. I want to warn him. He's asking for some pretty rough treatment. And this is what's happening when we are trying to address these problems in the world, the global development department, or in the law school with the human rights work. It is a pretty rough treatment, and we decided to do it. It takes time. It takes a lot of time to achieve goals. But after maybe 20 years with Ernesto, we achieve goals. After 20 years of writing this book, Daniel and Scott achieved a goal. I think this feeling of despair, this feeling of frustration is not only in academy, but it's also when we are doing this social work. We also feel a lot of frustration because it takes a lot of time to change things. And we see a lot of awful things every day, every single day. But maybe after 20, 30 years, we will tell our grandchildren, we changed this. And that's why we were living. That's why we were working. So maybe this is an answer how to keep going and to keep working and studying for what we are doing.
Thank you. Carolina, we have a lot to talk about. I just want to say that one of the things that moves me away from despair is when I read the draft of your master's thesis. And when I see how creatively you are using theater and art and photography, this makes me want to sing. And I can't sing very well, so that would. But you know, the secret for getting out of despair is really community and connection. I'll just tell a brief story. I feel like I can tell this at this point in my life and career. One of the reasons I'm here is because of David Greenwood. I never wanted to be a professor. I never wanted to get a PhD. I grew up in a town of 5,000 people in Illinois. Was a musician. After I spent 10 years as a community activist, I went to Minnesota because I had a burning question in me about what the heck is the connection between democracy and higher education. People are really angry at universities all the time because they're not doing things they're supposed to be doing, or they're doing things they shouldn't be doing. There's something there. There's some connection. So I didn't go to do a PhD. I went to work with Harry Boyd, who I thought I could learn something from. The reason I'm here is because of Harry Boyd. But when I showed up on this campus, when I got hired in August of 1999, I don't think, Carolina, I've told you this story. I've never told this story publicly. I think I just told it to you, Dan, last week. David Greenwood, who was on the search committee for the position, David was a professor in anthropology at the time. He had I think his office, it was in the same building that Sophia, your office is in. So after I came in August of 1999, he asked to meet with me. So I went over to his office. I still remember this in a crystal clear way. It's 22 years ago about. I went to his office. The only thing I remember from the meeting with him is sitting with him in an imposing way behind his desk and me sitting there in front of him. The only thing I remember is that he told me to make sure that I knew and didn't forget that this university doesn't care about people like me. or the work that people like me do, that this university doesn't care about that. Make sure, he wanted to make sure I knew that. So I left that meeting saying, yeah, thanks a lot, David. That was really great. My first month here, I've just been told that the university doesn't care about me. I'm telling this story because a few years later, after essentially I was told that I was not going to get tenure. Sorry to have to break the news to you, but I was told that I was not going to get tenure. It was David that pulled together a committee of mentors that enabled me to succeed. So the short answer to the question about this, I was in very deep despair at that moment. And this is all relative to different kinds of despair. We've heard about people being killed and assassinated, and there are different kinds of despair, but they can kill our souls and kill our sense of hope. And it is only by finding those people like David Greenwood and John Forrester who can help us to understand what's possible and who we are. And I hope that all of us understand that obligation if we have students, or if we have the chance to work with a student who's doing difficult work, that we understand the obligation we have to be a supporter and a listener.
We have Mary Jo, who had a few words she wanted to say as well.
I just wanted to respond to that, Carolina, because, and also to your story, Scott, because I think that is a framework that one has to understand. The university doesn't care about the farm worker program, absolutely not. But do we care about the work that we're doing in conjunction with, in partnership with farm workers? We do. And documenting that, writing that, organizing information systematically leads to the kind of book that Scott and Dan wrote. It leads to something that others can read that can inspire them. In the book, I don't know, you probably haven't had a chance to read it. I think it's Don Villarejo who says, the university is not a democracy, and the university is not a meritocracy. Don't do it because you think someone is going to recognize your good works and reward you. Do it because it's something close to you, it's something real, and it answers actual lived problems. That's one of the things the book underscores, which I think is really critical.
I know that we have set 5:30 as a closing time, and I want to respect that. But I'd like to just hand the microphone over just one last time to Dan, if you had any final thoughts. And then again, we'll spend a few minutes informally. I'm sorry, Matthias, I can't get to your question, but we can informally chat afterwards. But Dan, any final thoughts?
The preface ends with one sentence. Contests over truth are wars of attrition. Contests over truth are wars of attrition. So the invitation here is we can't let go of the truth. It's just like we're not going to let go of a public university. We're not going to let go of our government. We're going to hold the truth in an era of misinformation, chatter. Remember, there might be just a social freak out that a social species like human beings just realized that there's an existential crisis right now. That's how we just realized our own extinction is likely coming. So what is going to happen with that? Places like Cornell and the University of California must play an integral role in bringing forth truth and stabilizing community and building democracy at this moment. And so we're going to get roughed up if you speak the truth. You are going to get roughed up. And so this, what Galarza and everyone in the book is calling us to, is not for everyone. But a few people can make enormous changes in the world. And it's speaking to them to get in the river, to join. There is a river. And if enough of us go into the flow, those other people who are standing on the side, they will get in the water. So we need to get in the water first. And to the degree, negotiate that and help others to negotiate that. But they will be, we'll all chart those waters together. So contests over truth are wars of attrition. Get in that battle. you know, and I hate all the martial analogies as a Quaker, but it is a fight, by the way.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you all of us, of our friends on Zoom, and thank you for your attention. I want us all to sing just our appreciation to Scott and Dan and Aisha and Mary Jo. And again, some books here you can look at, informal conversation. Thank you so much.